Imagine a young graduate in Nairobi, she or he, whichever, but for the purpose of this episode or this example, let's use she. She has done everything everybody said was the right thing to do. She went to school, survived the exams, finished her degree, and then entered that familiar sea of looking for work. Most of the good jobs she sees online seem to exist in other people's countries. Jobs in London, San Francisco, Berlin. I mean, technological age. Expand your horizon. We want to do something that is consequential to the technological age that we're in. So she keeps scrolling days, nights, sending applications. But one day, a posting appears that feels reachable, and it is remote. It sounds very modern. The title on the screen says Data Annotator, a safety project. The description promises flexible hours. I mean, it's the chance to work with cutting edge technology and the feeling that you are contributing to the future of AI. But the pay is not spectacular, but it is in dollars. And in a tough economy, the combination of money and meaning is very persuasive. So fast forward a few months and this is alive. This is alive. It is still dark outside when she logs into her shift, remote job, login, normal life. Her job title still sounds clean and very impressive, right? Especially when she tells friends, oh, what do you do? We do data annotator. And it's for his AI company and his AI safety projects. And on her screen, the world in digital form arrives in fragments. Sentences to rate, which means she's rating if a sentence is maybe racism or is not harmful, depending on the scale that she needs to rate them. And also there are images to label. What is this? It's a cow. It's a goat. Label them appropriately. And then there are even conversations to judge as safe or unsafe. Some days the work is simply repetitive. It's doing the same thing over and over again, repeating the same image, annotating, labeling, doing what she needs to do. She clicks and clicks and clicks, trying not to get bored. She's doing something consequential, right? And it's safety. And also she's trying not to make mistake because, like I said, it is safety, and a simple mistake is consequential to the output that the AI or the LLM will give end users. And on days, what appears on our screen is pretty straightforward, like I said. But on some other days, what she sees, violent, disturbing, and deeply confusing data that she has to annotate. She sees things that the polished public demos will never see. I mean, they show you demos of how this chatbot works, and they give you the glossy, the very fine prints of how to use and what they are supposed to do. And internally, she has to decide, does this violate policy? Is this hateful? Especially most of these comments, most of this data are from a vast different sociological, psychological environment or context. Is this hateful? Is this allowed? In the background, time zones blur. She's awake when people who build the systems are asleep. Right. But here, the strange thing is her decision will help how AI model responds to millions of people around the world. And yet her name will never appear on any research paper, a press release, or even a keynote slide. In the official story, she's essentially invisible, or almost invisible. Now, it shifts sense. Let's move thousands of kilometers or miles away, startup capital of the world, where those decisions or policies are being made. The story of AI is told very differently. There is the tale of genius founders, breakthrough models, billion-dollar valuations, and a race towards something that we all know now. We know by name, AGI, artificial general intelligence. The images we see are conference stages, product launches, CEOs shaking hands with presidents. And we hear phrases like, it's going to be revolution, disruption, the next thing, the next best thing after internet, or even better than the internet. But the thing is, these two realities that I have constructed exist at the same time but usually we only see one. My name is G and I am a former librarian. On my African bookshelf, my role is to guide you to engaging and exploratory works on and about African books, stories, culture, anything African that can serve as a starting point for your own research and reflection. In this episode of my African bookshelf, we're slowing down with Empire of AI, Dreams and Nightmares in Sam Altman's Open AI by Karen Howe, a book that insists on putting these worlds in the same frame. It treats AI not just as a technology, but as a kind of modern empire. And it asks us to pay attention to the people, the places, and the resources that make the empire possible. So today, we are placing Empire of AI on my African bookshelf. So let us start with the book itself. So Empire of AI is a work of narrative fiction, non-fiction by journalist Karen Howe. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. If you follow AI reporting, you may have seen her articles before, or even if you follow technology reporters, specifically AI, like I said, you might or you may have come across her articles, which are careful, investigative pieces that often feel uncomfortable to read for companies she writes about. In this book, she follows the rise of OpenAI from its early days as a non-profit research lab with a somewhat idealistic mission to its transformation into one of the most powerful and secretive AI companies in the world. And on the surface, you could describe the book simply as the story of Sam Altman and OpenAI, but that is probably how it will sit on some bookstore tables, and especially when you look at the title, it seems to specifically focus on Sam Altman and OpenAI. Once you start to read or spend time, it becomes clear that the real subject is power, and we know who holds it, how it's justified, and who pays for it. So Karen keeps returning to a cluster of uncomfortable questions like who gets to decide what counts as intelligence? I mean, who defines it? And what counts as safety in terms of maybe guardrails? Who also pays the hidden cost of building systems that claim they will benefit humanity? Who is responsible? Who is allowed to move fast and break things? Structurally, the book moves in and out of the company. I mean, one moment we are with executives and then researchers hearing how they describe their mission, and then the next moment we are among workers, regulators, and then communities who are experiencing the direct impact of the decisions that these companies make. The movement between the center of the empire and its edges is one of the things that make this such a useful text for my African bookshop. And we're not reading this as a Silicon Valley gossip. We're reading it as a text about how empires form, how they speak about themselves, and what that means for everyone else. And specifically from the context of Africa, we're reading it from that context. And I'm trying to, again, I should say this is not a review of the book or of the work. It's just an entry or a starting point into an exploration into what the next frontiers of technology means for Africans. And what I tried to do, or what came to mind immediately as I was reading the book, was the oil boom in Africa as a whole. Before I link both the oil boom and AI boom, let's talk about the moment we're in. This book comes out of the moment we're in right now, obviously, which is the 2020s, which is AI boom. And if you are listening to this, there's a very good high chance you've already touched some AI system today, even if you did not call it by that name. Maybe you asked the chatbot to draft an email, or maybe your social media feed was ranked by a recommendation model that is backed by AI. Maybe your bank's fraud system ran your last card transaction through a machine learning model before approving it. AI is no longer a laboratory curiosity or a Hollywood fantasy used to sensationalize movies. It has moved into classrooms, offices, immigration systems, hospitals, and even our private chats, right? At the same time, money is pouring into the underlying infrastructure, chips, GPUs, massive data centers, And then we'll come to that in a second. Cloud platforms, undersea cables, and local data hubs, you name it. Governments talk about AI as a strategic weapon and as a route to economic dominance and freedom. No one wants to be left behind, or at least no one wants to feel as though they are not progressing when it comes to AI. We hear phrases like AI race, arms race, we can't afford to lose. We must be the best. We must be a step ahead because that rival country is sounding like it's wrong for them to be the leaders when it comes to AI. Alongside this excitement, a different story runs quietly underneath. And that's where we're going to. Workers in Kenya, and as the book describes, other parts of Global South are earning a few dollars an hour to label and moderate content so that these systems appear polite and safe to users sitting comfortably in the global north. Data centers are drawing huge amounts of electricity and water from communities that did not design these systems, but we have to live with their environmental consequences. Regulators, especially in countries with weaker institutions, most particularly in the global south, are struggling to keep up with corporate power that moves much faster than the law. And if you are listening from an African context, this pattern is not completely new. There's something very familiar about it. So here is my comparison, or here's almost a familiar feel. Once upon a time, there was the oil boom. Oil arrived wrapped in the language of transformation. There's going to be roads, hospitals, foreign reserves, national development. Honestly, in practice, the story was much more compelling. We saw pipelines cut through villages, farmlands and rivers became polluted. Wealth pulling in small circle and national economies rising and crashing on the back of prices that the indigenes of the villages that had or that housed those natural resources in form of oil or crude oil, they did not control. So if we put an old contract into a single sentence, it might sound like your land, our risks, your risk, our profits. Which basically means you provide the main ingredient or raw material, but we'll provide the risks. And then, which means you are going to have to deal with the risks as we profit, essentially. Now, with AI, the resources have changed, right? But it still feels the same. It still feels familiar. The new rush is not just for crude oil. It is for data, labor, energy, and connectivity. The logos also have changed. The languages have changed. But underneath, there's still a rush to capture value and to fix the rules in favor of those who arrive first. This is what Empire of AI talks about. This is what it tries to showcase or it tries to uncover. And it is this moment we're reading it from. So honestly, I read it, and I finished reading it. I said to myself, the author, Karen Howe, could have honestly written a straight corporate biography about, or which contained, oh, this person invested, this person got fired, this product shipped, or she just talks about the company itself. But she does something more ambitious. She treats OpenAI as the center of the imperial network. In that network, models and APIs radiate out into different countries through partnerships and platforms. And at the top, elite researchers, executives, and those in power make decisions. But at the bottom, low-paid annotators and moderators do repetitive, sometimes traumatizing work because their job requirements is to sift through the deepest, darkest parts of what makes up the internet, and they are to annotate, classify, and label. Somewhere in between, governments find themselves responding, drafting regulations, trying to catch up with something that they did not ask their permission for. And in the book, she goes on to mention examples in the global south. So You see countries like Nigeria, Uganda, companies entice labor with promise of doing something very consequential and essential to the safety of AI. Comparatively low wage. But when you look at the government of those countries, almost as if they are non-existent in terms of regulating and trying to understand the effects of what they are providing for the success of this new technology. For those of us with a history that includes literal empires, that word is not metaphorical. It recalls maps colored in foreign flags, borders drawn from a distance, resources reorganized to serve someone else's plan. And by using the word empire in the context of AI, Karen Howe is inviting us to treat these companies as political actors, not just as clever engineering teams. She's asking us to notice the new kinds of borders that are being drawn over who can access powerful models and who cannot, which languages are supported and which are ignored, whose safety is centered stage, and who is considered an acceptable casualty. The second move the book makes is to interrogate that beautiful phrase we also often hear, which is benefits of humanity. Hardly will you see any or hear any AI CEO right now that doesn't allude to the fact that, we're doing this for the benefit of all humanity. OpenAI's founding mission speaks about serving humanity, not just stakeholders. It sounds very generous, moralistic even, but Empire of AI spends time sitting in between the sentence and the actual everyday reality. Because for a model to be safe, someone has to look at the worst content the internet can produce and label it. And I know that must sound very abstract because what we know as the internet, or most of what we know as the internet, is what we see on what Google indexes, what our social media feeds have opportunity of, allowed us to have access to. But underneath this LLMs, a group of people, workers, laborers, have sieved through, like I said, through the deepest and darkest parts of the internet for a chatbot to sound friendly. Someone has to sit and rate his responses over and over again to make these systems feel easy and intuitive for us. Somebody's day essentially was hard to make that end product. And a lot of work has been quietly outsourced in places like, again, Kenya and other parts of the global south. The book pays attention to their pay, the contracts, and the emotional toll of this work and what it takes to do this work. And the pattern it reveals is one where risk, especially psychological risk, is pushed downwards, which is the global south. Almost as I want to say, test subjects. These people can do this work. They need the money. We shouldn't really care about their psychological well-being. They should do it. Most of these jobs were shipped to the global south. The work shifted global south while the profit and control remained concentrated upwards. For our shelf, this matters because it sits right at the intersection of ethics and structure. You can have excellent intentions in your mission statements, clean, careful, drafted English or French or whatever language, and still build something that relies on exploitative arrangements at the bottom. In other words, what I'm saying is, intention is not just enough. We have to look at the structure that builds said intention. So the third move is about visibility. Who gets to be visible in the story of AI and who remains a footnote, or who doesn't even appear as part of the structure. So one of the strengths of this book is that it keeps returning to people and places that are usually edited out. I'm sure most of us or most people have not even thought about how annotators or what it means to annotate. Because why do you even need to think about it? Your AI systems or your AI products that you use are doing such a fantastic job that you think all good and well. I don't really need to worry about the backend because that company has done. They must be doing something not morally or ethically good, that because of the product that they have made. But the book exposes or highlights annotators whose names we will probably never remember or will never come across, but whose work shapes the systems people rely on every day now. And the book also shows us communities or talks about communities that host these data centers without sharing in the ownership of those data centers. We are asked to think about users whose languages and culture are turned into training data without any real conversation about consent or benefits. And the empire grows partly by counting on the silence of these people, by assuming they will not be organized enough or audible enough to disrupt this well-curated story. But Howe's structure of moving between boardrooms and back office refuses that arrangement. He insists that the hidden labor is not a side note. It is part of the story. And there is the question of the stories the empire tells about itself, which is every empire, historical or digitally, has a narrative. We are bringing civilization, we are bringing development, we are bringing security. Same with the AI world. The stories sound like, oh, we are building this. Someone is building it, so we need to be better. We're trying to provide for humanity, to benefit the whole of humanity. But think of the lifestyle. Honestly, some of these claims may be true, but they can easily become a blanket that covers over very specific local forms of damage, especially in African countries where there's corruption and lack of efficient regulation. So for those of us reading from Africa, we've heard this over and over again. We have seen what happens when a project is declared too important to slow down. Or we have seen, or we know when people who raise concerns are told that they are standing in the way of progress. Empire of AI hands us a language and in detail what we can use to question these stories early before they harden into unquestioned common sense, which now become tradition or culture. So where does Empire of AI sit on my African bookshelf? The first place it sits is next to our oil stories. It sits next to our oil stories. In the Niger Delta, in the Cabinda, in many places across the continent, oil was supposed to be a ticket to something better. Communities watched flares in the night, smelled chemicals in their water, and saw soldiers on their streets. They saw deals signed in their name that they never saw and promises that never quite arrived. So if we translate that experience into the AI context, we could almost hear a new version of that old contract. But instead of your land, our rigs, or your risk, our profits, what you get is your data, your labor, your electricity, even your water. Because those are the resources that are needed for data centers. You hear, give us your data, your labor, your electricity, your water. But they are our models, they are our platforms, and we control them. It is still our environment and our social fabric being mobilized for someone else's infrastructure. Also, the second place where the book sits is alongside our trickster stories. We'll soon get into stories about the tortoise, Ijakpa. And in so many of these tales about Ijakpa, the tortoise, Ijakpa survives not because he's strong, but because he is observant. He studies the powerful more deeply than they study him. He watches their habits, their arrogance, their blind spots, and at the right moment, flips the script. So if you read Empire of AI from that angle, the book itself starts to look like a kind of modern trickster. It sneaks into the empire's corridors through interviews, documents, and it listens quietly. It gathers what it needs, and then it returns to us, the readers, to say, let me tell you what is really happening in the empire or in the king's palace. So for African readers, listeners, or whoever is interested in Africa, we are so often positioned as objects of other people's technology. So this book invites us into the role of observers, interpreters, and critics, not just users or victims. And now more than ever, for every tech you use, it is imperative to understand the underlying structure, not just as a user, but honestly as a concept of something that you need to investigate. Not because you want to find something wrong or something ethically wrong, but because you need to know what is really happening behind the scenes. So finally, Empire of AI belongs just next to our next episode, which is going to be first the familiar tales of oil booms and its promised transformation of human lives in Africa, and then also the trickster stories. And finally, in Howe's book, the territory shifts. It's because now things have become more very abstract in that we're not talking about things that we can touch or feel. We're talking about information. We're talking about behavior. We're talking about infrastructure. Finally, Empire of AI belongs on this shelf right next to music or album like Fela Kuti's Expensive Sheets, which will spend time in the next episode discussing or talking about. Fela's album kind of captures a state obsessed with controlling a musician's body when he smokes, when he excretes, whether his waste can be used against him. The body becomes the territory of surveillance and humiliation. And in Howe's book, the territory shifts. I mean, things have become very abstract now in that it's not just about your physical body anymore. It is the information, behavior, data, and infrastructure. And so the question becomes who controls what we see, who controls the tools that interpret our words, who owns the platform on which conversations take place. The technologies are different. A bucket in one story, a data center in the other, but the tension is strangely very similar. Who gets to be free and who is constantly being monitored, classified, and disciplined. I know I've said a lot, but let's now turn the camera more towards Africa. So this is my African bookshelf, right? Let's turn the cameras or the lens directly towards Africa. In the story of AI, Africa is not a spectator in this empire. It's woven into the story in at least three ways. First, through labor. Our younger graduates, like in the example in Nairobi, is not hypothetical. They are real workers in Kenya, Uganda, Nigeria, and beyond doing annotation and moderating for global AI projects. Their works makes the system safer and more usable for people all over the world. Yet, they are often paid poorly through third parties and easily replaced. They carry psychological burdens that do not show up on the glossy marketing slides. And secondly, Africa is interwoven through infrastructure. African countries are increasingly being approached as attractive locations for data centers and cloud regions. On paper, this sounds like progress. Oh, the cloud is coming from Africa. The infrastructure is based in Africa. But in reality, we have to ask the harder questions. Who own these facilities? Who set the rules for their operations? What pressure will they put on already stressed grids and water systems? What protections exist if there's a problem? Are local universities, regulators, and communities part of this conversation, or are they informed after the contracts have been signed? Last but not the least, through data and culture. African languages, stories, music, jokes, histories, anything you can think of culturally are part of the raw materials that feed modern AI. Tweets, YouTube videos, canned books, blogs, posts, anything you can think of, they all help models learn how humans speak and think. Some of that may be neutral, some of it may even be helpful, but again, recognize the pattern. Cultural and linguistic resources are extracted at scale, models are trained and monetized elsewhere, and then access flows backwards to Africans through a system we do not fully own or govern. When key decisions are made about how these systems are designed, who gets harms are prioritized when we talk about safety. Also, who has the power to switch the system off? When you think about it and when you look at it, infrastructure, Africa is really sitting as an equal at the table. When you check all these three provisions that come from Africa, but infrastructure, data, and culture, I think it's earned Africa a place at the decision table, or Africans. I don't solely blame these companies. If anything, more of the blame on the government in Africa. How do they make this decision? What place? Is it a place of greed or patriotism? Or is it from a place of actual need or want for progress within African communities? But one sentence we might carry away from this episode is Africa is plunged into the empire through labor, land, and data, but rarely holds the levers that decide how these systems are built, priced, and governed. And so, for my African bookshelf, that line is not the end of the conversation. It's the beginning, or we try to make it the beginning, or we want it to be the beginning. It opens up the question of technological sovereignty. What would it actually mean for African countries and communities to have real agency in technology space? No, in AI space. And underneath all of that, there is the quieter work of storytelling. Because empire is not only built with infrastructure and money, it is built with myths and storytelling. If the only available story is that this is inevitable, this is the future, this is how the world works now, then our imaginations get colonized before our institutions do. Storytellers, whether they are novelists, filmmakers, podcasters, librarians, musicians, archivists, whatever, they help keep other futures alive in our minds. And a book like Empire of AI joins that work by giving us detailed language and clear picture of how this particular AI empire operates. So, question to take away. As we place this book on the shelf, I want you to leave with a few questions to sit with, not as an exam, but as a prompt for your own thinking. When you hear the phrase artificial intelligence, whose faces and whose cities appear first in your mind? And where do African countries sit in that mental map? For example, where does Lagos, where does Nairobi, where does Accra, Johannesburg, and other cities, where does it sit? And if those places are missing, what does that tell us about who is seen as central or who is treated as peripheral to this? Forces us to think about the back end infrastructure, not from the technical background, but from the political, cultural, decision-making back end. And if we accept the book's framing that AI is becoming a kind of empire, what role do we as Africans want to play in it? Honestly, we don't need to answer all these questions. Like I said, I am just a librarian, making research on topics that we need to talk about or that should be talked about when it comes to African storytelling. I added one book to the African bookshelf. Like I said earlier, our next episode will be on Baba Fela Kuti's 12th album, Expensive Shit. Interesting story, interesting research, interesting questions to come out of it. And until next time, paying attention to the stories that are paying attention to you. See you. Subscribe, listen, ask questions. No stupid questions when you read. See you next time.